what you believe about the resurrection is what you believe about Christianity. Because without the resurrection, we have no Christianity. As 1 Corinthians 15:14 says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. So what we believe about the resurrection is really important. And one thing I learned in the past couple of years is that there actually are answers to our questions. A lot of people are skeptical about the resurrection. A lot of people will give Jesus his, street cred for being a good guy, but they stop short of believing that he actually rose from the dead. But if he didn't rise from the dead, then everything he said was, basically a lie, and nothing he said really mattered. And so I want to give us a couple of reasons why we can actually trust the resurrection is true. Now, I know that learning, facts and factoids in history, that is not all it takes for someone to give their life to Christ and become a Christian. But I do think having some of this information to make it a little bit more realistic and a little bit more solid can help. And so let's talk about some of the things that we do know. And that, number one, is that Jesus did die by crucifixion. That was a common way of executing people in that time. And Jesus was a documented real historical person, and it was documented that he was crucified. And what that means is that if you're crucified, you don't survive. And so we know that Jesus did die on the cross. And so that's sort of fact number one. Number two is that Jesus' disciples believe that he rose and appeared to them. And not only Jesus' disciples, but also there was, something like 500 other people that reported seeing Jesus after his resurrection. And this is the kind of stuff that was put out there publicly, and people could have, torn it down as a lie, but they didn't, because it actually happened. People saw him. What's interesting here, it says that this one author says that subsequent to Jesus' death by crucifixion, his disciples were radically transformed from fearful, cowering individuals who denied and abandoned him at his arrest and execution into bold proclaimers of the gospel of the risen Lord. Okay, so the disciples who had been following Jesus, but then when he is, killed on the cross, they're probably just totally confused because they believed him to be the savior of the world, and yet now he is killed, and they're probably sulking and crying and grieving and leaving, not recognizing, which I don't really understand why they wouldn't, because Jesus told them on the third day he would rise. But anyway, when he did rise and they reported seeing him, their attitudes completely changed. And in fact, it changed the whole rest of their lives, and they spent the rest of their lives, going out into the nations, spreading the gospel, and ultimately most of them being martyred for their faith. Had they not seen Jesus, they watched him die. Had they not seen him resurrected, what would have, given them the impetus to do such a thing? And one thing to note too is that, being martyred for their faith, at any time, one of them could have confessed that they were lying or making it up or it wasn't true and saved their own life. But the reality is they didn't do that. They didn't do that because they saw the resurrected Jesus and they believed it with all of their heart, and they lived out the rest of their lives in service to him and gave their lives for him too. Another interesting thing that I love pointing out this fact, and that is that some of the first witnesses to see Jesus were women. And what I've seen a lot of people point out is that if somebody was trying to pull one over in the history books, if you were trying to gain credibility for something you're saying that wasn't true, you would never ever report it at the time that it was women who first saw him, because they had no sort of social standing or credibility at that time. So the only reason to say that, these women were the first ones to see Jesus is if it was true. And so that's just a really interesting thing that, timing thing, context thing. So that's another one. Another thing is Paul's story. So Paul lived soon after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And as you know, Paul was a persecutor of Christians, number one. He was going around murdering them. You stay away from Paul if you're a Christian. And one day, God just stopped him in his tracks, literally, while he was walking down the road, blinded him, and Jesus appeared to him on the road. And in an instant, Paul went from being the persecutor and murderer of Christians to being the number one Christian of all time, basically. He went on to write most of the New Testament, spent the rest of his life preaching and teaching and training and all the things. And His testimony is that Jesus appeared to him on the road. And in that instance, his life was changed. We don't have video of that, no. But when you look at Paul's life, there's nothing else to explain why that would have happened. There's nothing else to explain the change. He had no interest in becoming a Christian. He hated Christians. And so what would explain it other than an encounter with the real Jesus, like to prove it to him without a doubt? Another really interesting thing that I found is that James, Jesus' brother, was not a Christian before the crucifixion and resurrection. He was a skeptic. He was not a follower. But what we find out in the Bible is that James actually converted to Christianity after Jesus was resurrected. So he saw Jesus after the resurrection. And once he saw him, he threw his skepticism aside. He stopped believing what he believed, and he became a Christian because he couldn't deny the truth of Jesus in front of his eyes after watching him be killed on the cross. And so just to recap a couple things, Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples believed he rose again. They reported seeing him. 500 people reported seeing him. James, his brother, who was not a believer, became a believer not after the crucifixion, but after the resurrection. Paul, who was a Christian, murderer of Christians, completely changed his life in an instant when Jesus approached him on the road. And then also the reporting that women were the first to report seeing Jesus after the resurrection, which would make no sense if someone were trying to write it down and convince us all of this lie. Because women had no credibility. So the only reason that it would be reported that way is if it were actually true. Now there's a lot more to it than that, but I think some of those basic facts kind of help get you started on the reasons why people do actually believe that the resurrection happened. And then there's a lot more to it. So maybe I will dig into that in the next video.